Was it possible to fall in love with someone you were never meant to feel anything for? The boardroom was silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of a pen against mahogany. Across the table, two families sat like opposing armies at a negotiation table, their faces carved from stone, their smiles rehearsed and hollow. Between them, a contract lay spread open, its pages filled with clauses about mergers, shares, and strategic alliances. But buried somewhere in the fine print was a different kind of clause, one that bound to lives together. Not through love, not through choice, but through necessity. Her name was Elena Heartfelt, and she was 26 years old when her father told her she would be married within 3 months. She didn't cry, didn't protest. She simply nodded, the way she had been taught to do since childhood. In her world, emotions were liabilities, tears were weaknesses, and love was a luxury reserved for people who didn't carry the weight of billion-dollar legacies on their shoulders. She had watched her father build an empire from ruins, had seen him sacrifice friendships, health, and joy for the sake of survival. Now he was asking her to do the same. The man she was to marry was named Julian, 32, heir to a pharmaceutical dynasty that spanned 3 continents. She had seen him once before, at a gala 2 years prior, standing near the champagne fountain with a look of profound boredom etched across his sharp features. He hadn't noticed her then. Why would he? She was just another face in a sea of tailored gowns and forced laughter. But now, circumstances had changed. His family needed her father's political connections. Her father needed their financial backing, and so, like chess pieces moved across a board by invisible hands, they were positioned together. Their first meeting as an engaged couple took place in a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a name, just an address whispered among those who mattered. Julian arrived 10 minutes late, his tie slightly loosened, his jaw tight with barely concealed irritation. Elena was already seated, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. When their eyes met, there was no spark. No recognition of fate or destiny, just a mutual understanding that they were both prisoners of the same gilded cage. "I suppose we should get the formalities out of the way," he said, his voice cool and professional. "I won't interfere with your life if you don't interfere with mine. We attend events together, play our parts in public, and maintain separate lives in private. Clean, simple, painless." She studied him for a moment. There was something almost sad about his efficiency, the way he had reduced their entire future to a business arrangement. But she understood it. Perhaps even appreciated it. At least he was honest. At least he wasn't pretending this was anything other than what it was. "Agreed," she replied, her voice steady. "I have my work, you have yours. We're colleagues, not soulmates." He raised his glass. To a mutually beneficial partnership. She clinked hers against his, and they drank in silence. The wedding was everything a society wedding should be. 300 guests, orchids flown in from Thailand, a dress that cost more than most people's homes. Photographers captured every smile, every embrace, every carefully choreographed moment. To the world, they looked perfect. The photos would run in magazines with headlines about power couples and modern dynasties. No one would know that the bride and groom had barely spoken during the reception, that their kiss at the altar had been as cold and brief as a handshake, that when they left in the vintage Rolls-Royce, they sat on opposite ends of the back seat, staring out different windows. Their home was a penthouse overlooking the city, all glass and steel and expensive emptiness. They had separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives that occasionally intersected at breakfast or during the rare evening when both happened to be home at the same time. Elena threw herself into her work at the family foundation, spending 14-hour days on projects that actually mattered to her. Julian disappeared into his laboratory, working on drug trials and research papers. They were polite when they crossed paths, cordial even, but there was a distance between them as vast and cold as the Arctic. Weeks turned into months. The media continued to celebrate their marriage. Friends and family commented on how well-suited they seemed. But behind closed doors, there were strangers who shared an address. Until the night, everything shifted. It was 3 in the morning when Elena woke to the sound of breaking glass. Her heart hammered as she grabbed her phone, ready to call security. But then she heard something else. A sound that made her pause. Someone was crying. Not the theatrical sobbing of distress, but the raw, broken sound of someone who thought they were alone. She moved through the darkened apartment, following the noise to Julian's study. The door was ajar. Inside, he sat on the floor, surrounded by shattered whiskey bottles, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. She should have walked away, should have respected his privacy and returned to bed. That was the arrangement after all. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the vulnerability she heard in those quiet sobs. Maybe it was her own loneliness recognizing its reflection in another person. Whatever it was, she found herself stepping into the room. Julian, he looked up, his face streaked with tears, his eyes red and unfocused. For a moment, he seemed confused, as if he had forgotten where he was. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by shame. He tried to compose himself, to rebuild the walls he always kept so carefully maintained. "I'm fine," he said, his voice cracking. "Just go back to bed." But she didn't. Instead, she sat down beside him on the floor, careful to leave space between them. She didn't ask what was wrong. didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. She simply stayed. And after a long silence, he began to speak. About his younger sister who had died 5 years ago from a disease his family's company could have prevented. About the guilt that ate at him every single day. About how he had turned himself into a machine because feeling anything at all was too dangerous, too painful, too human. Elena listened without interruption, and when he finally fell silent, exhausted and hollow, she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold and trembling. She held them gently, offering nothing but presence, no solutions, no judgments. Just another human being acknowledging another human being's pain. They sat like that until dawn painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Two people who had sworn to remain strangers, now connected by the thinnest thread of shared humanity. And when the sun finally rose, neither of them let go first. Something fundamental had shifted that night on the study floor, though neither of them acknowledged it aloud. In the days that followed, the silence between them became less empty. Elena found herself pausing in doorways, listening for the sound of Julian moving through the apartment. He began making coffee for 2 in the mornings, leaving a cup on the counter where she would find it, still warm. Small gestures, insignificant to anyone watching from the outside. But to two people who had spent months avoiding each other's existence, they felt monumental. The change was so subtle it could have been mistaken for coincidence, a shared glance that lasted a second longer than necessary. The way Julian held the door for her when they left for a charity gala, his hand hovering near the small of her back without quite touching. The way Elena asked about his research over dinner one evening, and he answered with actual enthusiasm instead of polite deflection. They were learning each other the way cartographers learn new territories, carefully mapping the terrain of another person's heart. It was during a business trip to Vienna that the walls between them began to truly crack. The trip was unavoidable, a pharmaceutical conference where Julian was scheduled to present, and Elena's foundation was co-sponsoring. They had separate hotel rooms on different floors, maintaining their unspoken boundaries. But on the second night, after a tedious reception filled with hollow conversation and champagne that tasted like expensive nothing, Elena found herself standing outside Julian's door at midnight. She knocked before she could question the impulse. He opened the door in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking surprised but not displeased. Behind him, the room was scattered with research papers and half-empty coffee cups. Classical music played softly from his laptop. He looked more real than she had ever seen him, more human without the armor of his perfectly tailored suits and calculated expressions. "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was true but not the whole truth. "And I thought maybe you'd want company." He stepped aside without a word, and she entered a space that smelled like his cologne and old books. They ended up on the balcony overlooking the illuminated city, the ancient architecture glowing golden against the night sky. Vienna spread beneath them like a fairy tale, all spires and history and whispered secrets. Elena wrapped her arms around herself against the cool air, and Julian disappeared inside, returning moments later with a blanket that he draped over her shoulders. His hands lingered for just a moment, and she felt the warmth of his fingers through the fabric. "Tell me something real," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the request. "Something you've never told anyone." Julian was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he leaned against the railing, his profile sharp against the city lights, and spoke. "I write poetry," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Terrible melodramatic poetry that would make English professors weep with despair. I have notebooks full of it hidden in my office. I started after my sister died because I didn't know what else to do with everything I was feeling. My father would disown me if he knew." The great Julian Cross, scientist and heir to a pharmaceutical empire, scribbling verses like a lovesick teenager. Elena felt something crack open in her chest. She turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw past the cold exterior to the person underneath. Someone who felt deeply but had been taught that depth was dangerous. Someone who created beauty in secret because vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I don't think that's something to be ashamed of," she said softly. "I think it's the most honest thing I've learned about you." He met her eyes then, and she saw something shift in his expression. A defiance maybe, or perhaps a decision being made in real time. He pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then began to read. His voice was uncertain at first, then grew stronger as he shared words he had written in his darkest moments, words about loss and loneliness and the ache of being alive. The poems were raw and imperfect and absolutely beautiful in their honesty. When he finished, the silence between them thrummed with electricity. "Your turn," he said. "Something real." Elena took a breath. "I'm terrified," she confessed. "Of all of this, of us, because somewhere between that night in your study and right now, I started caring. And caring wasn't part of the arrangement. We were supposed to be business partners playing house, and instead I find myself looking for you in every room. I hear your footsteps in the morning and something in me relaxes. I catch myself thinking about you during meetings, wondering what you're working on, if you've eaten, if you're happy. And I don't know what to do with that because we promised each other this wouldn't happen." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous. Julian stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Fear maybe, or hope, perhaps both. Elena, he said, her name sounding different in his mouth than it ever had before. He stepped closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. What if we rewrote the arrangement? What do you mean? What if we stopped pretending? His hand reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. What if we acknowledge that whatever this is between us, it's real? It's messy and complicated and definitely not what we signed up for, but it's real. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. That's terrifying. I know, his thumb traced along her jawline, his touch featherlight, but isn't it more terrifying to spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have happened if we'd been brave enough to try? The question hung between them in the Vienna night, the city lights blurring into stars, and Elena realized she was standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay the safety of their arrangement, the comfortable distance they had maintained for months. Ahead lay uncertainty and vulnerability and the genuine possibility of heartbreak, but it also held the promise of something neither of them had expected to find in their cold, calculated marriage. Something that felt remarkably like hope. She leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them by inches. Julian's breath caught. His other hand came up to cup her face, both of them frozen in that moment before everything changes. She could see her reflection in his eyes, could feel his pulse racing beneath her fingertips where her hand had somehow found its way to his chest. "Julian," she whispered, her lips close enough to his that the words brushed against his mouth. "Yes, I'm scared." "Me too." His forehead pressed against hers, and they stood there breathing the same air. Two people who had started as strangers and somehow found themselves here, on the edge of something profound and irreversible. "But I think," she continued, her voice trembling with courage she didn't know she possessed, "I think I want to be scared with you. I think I've been scared alone for too long." Something in Julian's expression shattered and reformed. His hands trembled against her face, and she realized he was crying, silent tears sliding down his cheeks. She reached up and wiped them away with her thumbs. This man who had presented himself as cold and untouchable, now completely vulnerable in her hands. "I never thought," he started, his voice breaking. "I never thought anyone would see me. The real me, beneath all the performance. I never thought I'd want them to. But you, Elena, God, you see everything, don't you? Only because you let me." He laughed, a wet, broken sound that was somehow the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. And then he was kissing her, soft and desperate and achingly tender. It wasn't like the cold, obligatory kiss they had shared at their wedding. This was a confession, an apology, a promise. His lips tasted like coffee and salt from his tears, and Elena felt something inside her chest bloom open like a flower that had been waiting years for sunlight. They kissed until the city bells chimed 3 in the morning, until Vienna settled into the deep quiet of late night, until they were both breathless and trembling. When they finally pulled apart, Julian rested his forehead against hers again, his hands still cradling her face like she was something precious. "Come inside," he whispered, and it wasn't a demand but a question, an invitation. Elena nodded, and he took her hand, lacing their fingers together as he led her back into the hotel room. But instead of what she might have expected, he simply pulled her down onto the couch, wrapped the blanket around both of them, and held her. Just held her, his arms secure around her waist, her head tucked beneath his chin, their legs tangled together. Outside, Vienna dreamed. Inside, two people who had married as strangers discovered what it felt like to be known. They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other, their carefully constructed walls finally irrevocably crumbling into dust. Morning arrived too soon, soft light filtering through the curtains and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Elena woke first, disoriented for a moment before she felt the solid warmth of Julian's body against hers, his arms still draped protectively across her waist. She stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile thing had formed between them in the darkness. His breathing was deep and even, his face relaxed in sleep in a way she had never witnessed before. Without the tension he carried like armor, he looked younger, almost boyish. She wondered how much of his life he had spent performing, pretending, building walls so high even he couldn't see over them anymore. She carefully extracted herself from his embrace and slipped out onto the balcony, pulling on his discarded suit jacket against the morning chill. Vienna was waking up below, the city stretching and yawning into a new day. Church bells rang somewhere in the distance. A tram rattled past on ancient tracks. She felt different somehow, as if crossing that threshold last night had changed her at a molecular level. They had kissed, they had held each other, they had been honest in ways that terrified her. And now she had to figure out what happened next. The sound of the balcony door opening made her turn. Julian stood there in rumpled clothes, his hair falling across his forehead, looking uncertain in a way that made her heart ache. "You left," he said simply, and she heard the question underneath. "Did you regret it? Was it a mistake?" "I just needed air," she replied, and watched relief flood his features. He crossed to her, and this time when he wrapped his arms around her from behind, there was no hesitation. He pulled her back against his chest, his chin resting on top of her head, and they stood watching the city wake together. "We have to go back today," he murmured against her hair. "Back to reality. I know I don't want this to disappear when we do. I don't want to go back to being strangers who share an address." Elena turned in his arms so she could see his face. There was vulnerability there, raw and unguarded. "Neither do I, but Julian, our families, the expectations, the reason we got married in the first place, none of that has changed. We're still trapped in this arrangement." Then we changed the arrangement. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle but insistent. "We make it real. We tell our families that something has shifted, that we're choosing this, choosing each other." She wanted to believe it could be that simple. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, doubt crept in like frost. "And if they don't accept that, your father married you off to secure my father's political connections. My father used me as a bargaining chip to save his company. What makes you think they'll suddenly care about what we want?" Julian's jaw tightened, that familiar hardness returning to his features. But when he spoke, his voice was soft. "Because we'll make them understand. We'll find a way." He kissed her forehead, and she felt a promise in it even as uncertainty gnawed at her. They returned to the city 3 days later, landing in a rainstorm that matched Elena's internal turbulence. The driver took them to the penthouse, and as they rode the elevator up, she felt the weight of their old lives settling back onto their shoulders. Julian must have felt it too, because he reached for her hand, squeezing gently, a reminder, an anchor. But the moment they stepped into the apartment, something felt wrong. The lights were on. Voices echoed from the living room. Elena's stomach dropped as she recognized her father's sharp, commanding tone, followed by the deeper rumble of Julian's father, Victor Cross. They entered the living room to find both patriarchs waiting for them, seated on opposite sides of the white leather furniture like opposing generals. Her father's face was a mask of controlled fury. Victor Cross wore an expression of cold disappointment. Between them, spread across the coffee table, were photographs. Dozens of them. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the images. Her and Julian on the Vienna balcony, his hands on her face. The two of them entering his hotel room together at midnight. Them wrapped in each other's arms, visible through the sheer curtains. Someone had been watching them. Someone had documented every moment of their vulnerability. "Sit down," her father commanded, his voice like iron. Julian's hand tightened around hers, but she pulled away, suddenly unable to bear being touched while her father's eyes bore into her with such contempt. They sat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. 7 months. Victor Cross finally spoke, his voice measured and cold. 7 months you've been married, and we've received reports that you barely speak to each other, that you maintain separate lives. That this union, which was meant to solidify our family's alliance, has been nothing but a facade. We were willing to overlook that as long as you maintained appearances in public. But this," he gestured to the photographs with disgust, "this is unacceptable." Elena's confusion must have shown on her face, because her father let out a harsh laugh devoid of humor. "You think we're angry that you've gotten close, that you've developed feelings? God, Elena, how naive are you?" "I don't understand," she managed, her voice sounding small even to her own ears. "The arrangement was never about love," her father continued, standing now, pacing like a caged predator. "It was about control, about maintaining the balance of power between our families. You were supposed to be our representative in the Cross household. Elena, your job was to observe, to report, to ensure that when decisions were made, we had insight and leverage. And Julian," he turned his cold gaze to her husband, "you were meant to do the same for your father. 2 spies in an arranged marriage, keeping their families informed, maintaining the equilibrium of mutual distrust that keeps this partnership functional." The words hit Elena like physical blows. She looked at Julian and saw her own horror reflected in his face. "What?" she whispered. Victor Cross stood as well, buttoning his jacket with precise movements. "Did you really think we would trust each other enough to simply merge our interests? Your father controls politicians, judges, entire regulatory bodies. I control pharmaceutical patents, research that could be worth billions or destroy reputations. We needed insurance, collateral. You two were meant to be that insurance." "You're saying we were planted," Julian said, his voice hollow, "that our marriage was meant to keep us apart, to make us weapons against each other. And you failed spectacularly at that singular purpose." Elena's father spat. "Whatever this is," he gestured between them with revulsion, "ends now. You will return to the original arrangement. Separate lives, cordial distance, and you will begin doing what you were always meant to do. Report to us everything, his research, Elena, his family's vulnerabilities, their plans. And Julian," Victor added, "you will monitor her father's political movements, his alliances, his weaknesses." That was always the agreement. Elena felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Every moment of her marriage suddenly took on a sinister quality. The separate bedrooms weren't just about maintaining distance. They were strategic positions. The politeness wasn't courtesy, it was surveillance. Her father had orchestrated her entire life, and when he finally gave her to another family, it was as a spy, a tool, not even a person, just a means to an end. She looked at Julian and saw devastation etched across his features. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Did you know what we were supposed to be?" "No," he said immediately, reaching for her, but she flinched away. Elena, I swear to God, I had no idea. My father told me this was about business, about alliances, about securing the family's future. He never said anything about espionage or surveillance or using you as an informant. How convenient, her father sneered. Of course you didn't know. Neither of you were supposed to know. You were supposed to naturally distrust each other, to maintain that distance. To come running to us with information because you felt more loyalty to your blood families than to each other. But somehow, despite our best efforts to ensure incompatibility, you've managed to do the one thing we specifically designed this marriage to prevent. You've fallen for each other. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these men who had manipulated every aspect of her life. So what happens now? Julian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. You've told us what we were meant to be, what we're meant to do. What if we refuse? The smile that crossed Victor Cross's face was predatory. Then your research funding disappears. Julian, that trial you've been working on for 3 years, the one that could save thousands of lives, cancelled the laboratory. Shut down. I own it all, son. Every patent, every piece of equipment, every discovery you've made. It all belongs to the company, which means it belongs to me. You want to play the rebel, fine, but people will die because of your selfishness. Elena's father turned his attention to her. And you, my dear daughter, that foundation you love so much, the one feeding hungry children, building schools, providing medical care to underserved communities. I control the funding. Every dollar flows through accounts I manage. You defy me, and I pull it all. Every program collapses. Every child you've helped goes back to sleeping hungry. Can you live with that? It was blackmail, pure and calculated and devastatingly effective. They had been given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Betray each other and continue the work that gave their lives meaning, or choose their love and watch people suffer for it. Elena felt Julian's hand find hers again, and this time she didn't pull away. Their fingers laced together, holding on like drowning people clutching debris. You're monsters, Julian said quietly, looking between their fathers. Both of you. You've turned love into a weapon and then act surprised when we refuse to use it against each other. We're realists, Victor corrected coldly. And you're both fools if you think love conquers all. This isn't a fairy tale, Julian. This is business. This is legacy. This is power. And you will both learn that lesson one way or another. The two men stood, collecting their coats and preparing to leave. At the door, Elena's father turned back. You have 1 week to decide. Either you return to the arrangement as it was intended, or we pull our support and you watch everything you've built crumble. Think carefully about what matters more to you, each other, or the lives you could be saving. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a guillotine falling. Elena and Julian stood in the wreckage of their living room, still holding hands, surrounded by photographs of their happiness being used as evidence of their failure. The silence was deafening. Neither of them spoke for a long time, both trying to process the magnitude of what they had just learned. Finally, Elena broke. She pulled her hand from Julian's and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights blurring through her tears. They're right, she whispered. We were naive to think we could have this, that we could choose each other without consequences, Elena. No, she turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks now. Don't you see? They've won. They've designed this so perfectly that no matter what we choose, we lose. If we stay together, children starve and patients die. If we go back to being strangers, we destroy the one real thing either of us has ever had. There's no winning this. Julian crossed to her, and she saw that he was crying too, his face wet with tears. He wasn't bothering to hide. Then we don't play their game, he said fiercely. We find another way. We find different funding, different support. We rebuild with what we're heirs. Julian, we've never had to build anything from scratch. Everything we have, they gave us. They own us. The truth of it settled over them like ash. They were prisoners who had briefly tasted freedom, only to discover their cage had merely expanded, not disappeared. And now they stood at an impossible crossroads, knowing that whatever they chose would haunt them forever. The week that followed felt like living in a mausoleum. Elena and Julian moved through the penthouse like ghosts haunting the same space, careful not to touch, barely speaking. Not because they wanted distance, but because closeness made everything hurt more. Every glance was a reminder of what they stood to lose. Every accidental brush of hands in the hallway felt like a small death. The photographs their fathers had left behind remained on the coffee table, neither of them able to bring themselves to throw them away or look at them. Evidence of a happiness that had lasted exactly 3 days before being weaponized against them. Elena spent her days at the foundation throwing herself into work with manic intensity. She visited every site, spoke to every family, memorized every face of every child her programs served. As if by cataloging what would be lost, she could somehow make the choice easier, but it had the opposite effect. How could she choose her own happiness when it meant a little girl in the Bronx would lose her after-school meals? When it meant a clinic in Detroit would close its doors? When it meant hundreds of people would suffer because she had dared to fall in love? Julian was doing the same. She would hear him on phone calls late at night, his voice tight with desperation as he contacted other pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, anyone who might fund his work independently. But the cross name was too big, too powerful. No one wanted to risk Victor's wrath by poaching his son's projects. Julian's trial was groundbreaking, a potential cure for a disease that killed thousands annually, but it was also expensive, risky, and entirely dependent on his father's continued support. Without it, years of work would evaporate. Patients who had pinned their hopes on his research would be left with nothing. On the fourth night, Elena found Julian in his study, surrounded by grant applications and funding proposals. All of them rejected. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep. When he saw her in the doorway, something in his expression crumbled. "I can't find a way out," he admitted, his voice raw. "I've called everyone, begged, bargained, offered to give up patents, royalties, everything. But my father has made sure that crossing him means professional suicide. No one will touch this research if it means making an enemy of Victor Cross." Elena moved into the room and sat across from him, the desk a barrier between them that felt symbolic. "I know it's the same for me. The foundation's funding is so entangled with my father's accounts that separating it would take years of legal battles. And even if we won, the damage would be done. Programs would collapse while we fought. People would suffer in the interim." They stared at each other across that desk, to people who had found something precious in the wreckage of an arranged marriage, now watching it slip through their fingers like water. "What if we just did it anyway?" Julian said suddenly. "What if we stayed together and let them pull their support? We could find other work. Start smaller. Build something new that they don't control. And the people who die while we're building. The children who go hungry. The patients waiting for your cure." Elena's voice broke. "Could you live with that? Because I don't think I could. Every time I looked at you, I would see their faces. Every moment of happiness would be tainted by the knowledge of what it cost. So we sacrifice ourselves instead. We go back to being prisoners in separate cells. And we do it for the rest of our lives." "Elena, that's not nobility. That's just a different kind of death." She wanted to scream at him that she knew that she felt it too, that every fiber of her being was rebelling against the choice they were being forced to make. But instead, she just sat there, numb with exhaustion and grief, wondering how love could feel so much like punishment. The silence stretched between them until Julian spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "There's another option." Elena looked up, saw something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "We play their game, but we play it better than they do." He leaned forward, and she could see his mind working, that brilliant analytical brain that had made him one of the youngest pharmaceutical researchers to ever lead a major trial. "They want us to spy on each other. Fine, we give them information, but we control what they see. We feed them what we want them to know, and we use that access to dig into their operations, find leverage, find something we can use to free ourselves. You're talking about going to war with our own families. I'm talking about survival." His hands clenched into fists on the desk. "They started this, Elena. They turned our marriage into a battlefield. I'm just suggesting we actually fight back instead of lying down and accepting defeat." It was dangerous. It was possibly insane. But as Elena sat there considering it, she felt something spark to life in her chest. Not hope, exactly. Something fiercer, something that tasted like rage. "If we do this," she said slowly, "we can't make mistakes. If they catch on, they'll destroy us. Not just our work, us. They'll make sure we have nothing and no one." I know Julian's eyes met hers, and she saw the same fire burning there. "But at least we'd be fighting. At least we'd be trying. I'd rather go down swinging than spend the next 50 years wondering what might have happened if we'd been brave enough to try." Elena thought about her father's face when he'd called her naive, about Victor Cross's predatory smile, about all the ways they had been manipulated and controlled and used as chess pieces in a game they hadn't even known they were playing. And she thought about Julian's arms around her in Vienna, the poetry he'd shared, the vulnerability he'd offered, the way it felt to be seen and known and chosen. "Okay," she said, "we fight." The change in their dynamic was subtle but profound. The outside world, to any surveillance their fathers might have arranged, they appeared to return to their original arrangement. Separate bedrooms, polite distance, cordial but cool interactions. But in the spaces between, in the moments they carved out when no one was watching, they became conspirators. Late at night, they would meet in Julian's study, the one room they'd swept for listening devices and cameras. They would sit close, speaking in whispers, sharing everything they learned. Elena had access to her father's calendar, his correspondence, his network of political allies. She began copying files, documenting meetings, building a map of his operations. Julian did the same with his father's pharmaceutical empire, digging into research that had been buried, patents that had been suppressed, connections to regulatory bodies that looked suspiciously corrupt. What they found made their blood run cold. Elena discovered that her father's political influence wasn't just about campaign donations and networking. He had been systematically blackmailing officials for decades, building a web of compromised politicians who voted exactly how he wanted them to. The foundation she ran, the one she thought was doing genuine good, It was also being used to launder money and create favorable press that disguised his more sinister operations. Julian uncovered something even darker in his father's empire. The pharmaceutical company had been suppressing research that could have saved lives because it would have competed with more profitable drugs they already produced. His sister, the one who had died 5 years ago, had died from a disease that Victor's company could have treated. They had chosen profit over her life. The revelations bonded them in ways even Vienna hadn't. They were no longer just two people who had fallen in love despite the odds. They were allies in a war against the people who had raised them. It was terrifying and exhilarating and utterly consuming, but playing both sides took its toll. Elena had to sit through dinners with her father, pretending to be the dutiful daughter while he asked pointed questions about Julian's research. She fed him carefully curated information. Details that seemed important but were ultimately meaningless, all while her skin crawled with disgust. Julian did the same, meeting with his father weekly, presenting reports on Elena's foundation activities while hiding the truth about what they'd discovered. The stress of it began to show. Elena lost weight, dark circles appearing under her eyes. Julian's hands developed a tremor he couldn't quite control. They stole moments together when they could, stolen kisses in the back of town cars, hands clasped under tables at public events, whispered words of encouragement in darkened hallways. But the weight of their deception hung over everything. 2 months into their subterfuge, something shifted. Elena was in her father's office, supposedly dropping off some documents when she saw a folder on his desk marked with Julian's name. Her heart stopped. She glanced at the door, heard her father on a phone call in the adjacent room, and made a split-second decision. She photographed every page with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. That night, she and Julian went through the documents together. What they revealed made her feel physically ill. Her father had been planning to dissolve their marriage all along. Once he had extracted enough useful information from Julian through Elena's reports, he intended to manufacture a scandal that would justify an annulment. Julian would be disgraced, his research discredited, and Elena would be free to be married off to someone else more strategically valuable. He never intended to let us stay married, Elena whispered, staring at her father's handwritten notes. We were always temporary, disposable. Julian's jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth grinding. My father has a similar file. I saw it last week but couldn't get access. I'm willing to bet it says something identical. They've been planning our expiration date from the beginning. The betrayal was complete. Not only had their fathers manipulated them into this marriage, they had never even intended to honor the arrangement long term. They had used their own children as temporary tools, to be discarded once they'd served their purpose. Something inside Elena snapped. All the years of being the perfect daughter, of following every rule, of sacrificing her own desires for her family's ambitions. All of it had been for nothing. She had been nothing to her father except a means to an end. She looked at Julian and saw the same realization dawning in his eyes. The same rage, the same determination. We have enough, she said quietly. Between what I found and what you've uncovered, we have enough to destroy them both. The blackmail, the suppressed research, the corruption. We could go to the authorities. We could burn it all down, and in the process we'd destroy ourselves too, Julian replied. Our names are attached to these empires. We've benefited from their crimes, even unknowingly. Going public means we lose everything, not just their support, everything. I know. They sat in the heavy silence of that knowledge. They had found their leverage, their weapon. But using it would be mutually assured destruction. There would be no victory, only varying degrees of ruin. Julian reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. Maybe that's what freedom costs. Maybe we have to be willing to lose everything to truly be free. Elena squeezed his hand, feeling the tremor in his fingers, seeing the exhaustion carved into his face, knowing she looked just as destroyed. They had been playing a dangerous game, and now they'd reached the moment where they had to decide how far they were willing to go. There's one other option, she said slowly, an idea forming. What if we didn't destroy them? What if we just made them afraid enough of being destroyed that they had to let us go? Julian's eyes widened as he understood. Blackmail. We threaten to expose everything unless they give us what we want. Our freedom. Full funding for your research, independent of your father's control. The foundation transferred entirely to my oversight with no strings attached, and they leave us alone forever. It was risky. Their fathers were powerful men who didn't respond well to threats, but it was also the only play they had left that didn't end with everyone losing. They'll fight back, Julian warned. They'll try to discredit us, ruin us, turn us against each other. Let them try. Elena felt something fierce and unbreakable settling into her bones. We've already been through their worst. We've already been used and manipulated and betrayed. What more can they do to us that we haven't survived already? Julian studied her face for a long moment, and she saw pride flickering in his expression alongside the fear. When did you become so fearless? When I realized I had something worth fighting for. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and deliberate and full of promise. When I realized I'd rather risk everything with you than live safely without you. They set the meeting for a Saturday afternoon in the penthouse, neutral ground where both families had equal claim. Elena and Julian spent the morning preparing, laying out documents, printing photographs, organizing evidence into 2 identical folders, one for each father. Everything was labeled, cross-referenced, damning. Years of corruption and suppressed research and criminal negligence, all compiled into packages that could destroy 2 empires with a single phone call to the right journalist. Elena's hands were steady as she arranged the final pages. She had passed through fear somewhere in the night and emerged on the other side into a strange calm. This was it. The moment everything either fell apart or came together. There was no middle ground anymore. Julian stood at the window, watching the city below. He was wearing a dark suit, his hair carefully styled, every inch the heir to a pharmaceutical dynasty. But Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh. When he turned to look at her, his eyes were storm gray and determined. "Last chance to back out," he said softly. "Once we do this, there's no taking it back. I don't want to take it back." She crossed to him, straightened his tie even though it didn't need straightening. "I want us to be free, whatever that costs." He caught her hands, pressed them against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering. "If this goes wrong, if they destroy us, I need you to know something. These last few months with you, fighting beside you, being seen by you, it's been worth everything. Even if we lose, we won't lose." She said it with a certainty she didn't entirely feel, but needed to project. "We can't. We have the truth on our side. Since when does truth matter to men like our fathers? Since we made it matter." The intercom buzzed. Their fathers had arrived together, which was interesting. Elena had expected them to arrive separately, to maintain the illusion of independence. But apparently they had coordinated, which meant they suspected something. That was fine. Let them suspect. They wouldn't know the full extent until it was too late. Victor Cross and Thomas Hartwell entered the penthouse with the confidence of men who had never lost a battle. Both wore expensive suits. Both carried themselves with the easy arrogance of wealth and power. They looked at their children with a mixture of expectation and disdain, already anticipating surrender. "I trust you've come to your senses," Thomas said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Are you ready to return to the arrangement as designed?" "Sit down," Elena replied, her voice cool and professional. "Both of you. We have some things to discuss." Something in her tone made them pause. Victor's eyes narrowed. Thomas's jaw tightened. But they sat because curiosity outweighed caution. They wanted to know what game their children thought they were playing. Julian remained standing, his presence commanding. "You've spent months manipulating us, using our marriage as a tool for corporate espionage, threatening to destroy the work we care about if we didn't comply. You turned something that should have been ours into a weapon." "Your children," Victor said dismissively. "You don't understand how the world works, how power is maintained. We did what was necessary." "Necessary," Elena repeated, and let the word hang in the air like a curse. She picked up one of the folders, walked over to her father, and dropped it on his lap. Then she did the same with Julian's father, opened them. Thomas opened his folder first, his expression bored. Then, as he began reading, the color drained from his face. Page after page of documented blackmail. Emails to compromised politicians. Bank records showing money laundering through the foundation. Photographs of meetings that were supposed to be secret. Evidence of crimes that could send him to prison for decades. Victor was slower, more methodical. But as he read through the suppressed research, the buried trials, the evidence that his company had chosen profit over saving lives, including his own daughters, his hands began to shake. His face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Where did you get this?" Thomas's voice was barely controlled fury. "Does it matter?" Elena asked. "What matters is that we have it, copies of it. Copies of it, multiple copies stored in multiple locations. And we have contacts at major newspapers, investigative journalists who would love nothing more than to expose 2 of the most powerful families in the country as the criminals they are." "You're bluffing," Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You wouldn't destroy your own family names. You'd ruin yourselves in the process. Would we?" Julian stepped forward, his presence suddenly dangerous. "Or would we be the brave whistleblowers who expose corruption at great personal cost? The children who chose morality over money? I think we'd come out of it quite well, actually. Diminished financially, perhaps, but free." The word hung in the air between them. Free. Thomas stood abruptly, the folder scattering papers across the floor. "This is treason. You're conspiring against your own family." "We learned from the best," Elena shot back. "You've been conspiring against us from the moment you arranged this marriage. Did you really think we wouldn't find out? That we'd just comply forever like obedient puppets? You ungrateful." "Careful," Julian interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "You're going to want to think very carefully about what you say next. Because here's what's going to happen. You're going to transfer full, unrestricted control of my research to an independent foundation, with funding guaranteed for the next 10 years, no strings attached. The trial continues. The work continues. But you have no oversight and no control. And you," Elena turned to her father, "are going to transfer complete operational control of the charitable foundation to me. All of it. The accounts, the programs, everything. You'll ensure it's fully funded and legally separated from your other operations, and you'll have no access, no influence, no say in how it's run. And if we refuse, Victor asked, though they all knew the answer. Then we release everything, Elena said simply. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence, we burn it all down. Your companies, your reputations, your freedom, all of it gone. And yes, we'll lose things too. Our names will be tainted by association. We'll lose money, status, comfort. But we'll have something you can never understand. We'll have each other. We'll have our integrity. We'll have the knowledge that we chose right over easy. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas and Victor looked at their children with expressions that cycled through rage, disbelief, and something that might have been grudging respect. They had underestimated Elena and Julian, had seen them as pawns when they should have recognized them as players. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice tight. "You thought this through." "We've had time," Elena replied. "You gave us a week to decide what mattered more. We decided, and we spent the last 2 months building our case." "You've been playing us this entire time," Victor said slowly, realization dawning. "The reports we were getting, the information you were feeding us, it was all curated, all controlled. You taught us to spy," Julian said with a cold smile. "You just didn't anticipate we'd be good at it, or that we'd use those skills against you." Victor stood, and for a moment Elena thought he might try to physically attack them, but instead he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that held no humor. "You think you've won. You think you've outsmarted us, but you're still children playing at being adults. You have no idea the forces you're dealing with." "Then enlighten us," Elena challenged. "Tell us why we should back down, why we should return to being your tools. Convince us." Thomas and Victor exchanged a long look, some unspoken communication passing between them. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. "If we agree to your terms, what guarantee do we have that you won't release this information anyway? That you won't use it to destroy us after you've gotten what you want?" "You have our word," Julian said. "Your word," Victor scoffed. "That's supposed to be sufficient." "It's more than you ever gave us," Elena pointed out. "You never intended to honor the original arrangement. We found the dissolution plans. We know you were going to discard us the moment we'd served our purpose. So yes, all you have is our word. But unlike you, when we make a promise, we keep it." The truth of it settled over the room. They all knew Elena and Julian held the power now. The evidence existed. The threat was real. The question was whether Thomas and Victor would bend or break. Minutes passed in heavy silence. Elena felt Julian's hand find hers, their fingers interlacing united front. No matter what happened next, they were in this together. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Fine. You'll have your foundation, fully funded, fully autonomous, but there are conditions." "We're listening," Elena said carefully. "You never contact us again. Either of you. This is it. We give you what you want, and you walk away from both families entirely. No holidays, no appearances, no using the family name for your own benefit. You want freedom, and this is what it costs. Complete severance." Elena felt something twist in her chest. Despite everything, despite knowing what her father was, some part of her had hoped for reconciliation, for understanding, for him to say he was proud of her strength, even if he disagreed with her choices. But that was a fantasy. Thomas Hartwell didn't know how to be a father, he only knew how to be a strategist. "And my research?" Julian asked. Victor's jaw clenched. "You'll have your funding, but the cross name comes off all your work. You publish under your own credentials, not the family's. And you're cut off from all other family assets. The apartment, the cars, the trust fund, all of it gone. You'll have enough to live on from your research funding, but you'll be starting over in every other way." It was a brutal severance. They were offering freedom but demanding exile. No safety net, no family support, just Elena and Julian against the world, with their work and each other. Elena looked at Julian, saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. This was it, the final choice. They could take this deal and walk away with their independence but nothing else. Or they could refuse and watch the war escalate until everyone lost. Julian squeezed her hand. 3 pulses, an old code they'd developed. A question, "Are you sure?" She squeezed back. 4 pulses, her answer, "I'm with you, we accept," Julian said. "One more thing," Elena added, her voice steady. "You never come after us, not through business channels, not through social pressure, not through any means. You leave us alone, completely, or the evidence goes public. That's non-negotiable." Thomas's face was stone. "Agreed. And the marriage?" Victor asked. "You intend to stay married, or was this whole performance just about extracting resources?" Julian pulled Elena closer to his side. "We stay married, because unlike the arrangement you forced on us, this is our choice. We choose each other every day. Without contracts or obligations or ulterior motives, just us." Something flickered across both fathers' faces. Envy maybe, or regret. The knowledge that in trying to control everything they had created something they could never have. A partnership built on truth instead of manipulation. Love that had survived being weaponized. The lawyers came 3 days later with documents to sign. Page after page of legal severance, transferring assets, establishing independence. Elena's hand cramped from signing. but she never hesitated. Each signature was another step toward freedom when it was done, when every document was notarized and filed, when the money had been transferred and the control had been relinquished. Elena and Julian stood in the penthouse that was no longer theirs. They had 72 hours to vacate, to pack up their lives and begin again. Julian found her in the bedroom they'd never shared as a married couple should, looking out at the city lights one last time from this height. "Regrets?" he asked softly. She turned to him. "Not even one." He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She melted into his embrace, feeling the solid reality of him. They had lost so much: family, wealth, status, security. But they had gained something infinitely more valuable. They had gained themselves. "Where do we go from here?" she whispered against his chest. "Anywhere we want," he replied. "We're finally free to choose." They found a brownstone in Brooklyn, wedged between a bookstore and a cafe that served coffee so strong it could wake the dead. It was nothing like the penthouse. The floors creaked. The radiator clanged in winter. The bathroom tiles were mismatched, and the kitchen was barely large enough for two people to stand in at once. But it was theirs, truly theirs. Paid for with money they'd earned, filled with furniture they'd chosen together, marked by memories they were creating without anyone watching or judging or manipulating. Elena turned one of the spare rooms into an office for the foundation. The walls became covered with photographs of the people her program served, their faces a constant reminder of why she did this work. She hired a small team, people who believed in the mission rather than the prestige. Together they expanded into neighborhoods her father had deemed unprofitable. They started programs he would have called wasteful, and they changed lives in ways that couldn't be measured by quarterly reports or tax write-offs. Julian converted the basement into a makeshift laboratory. Though he spent most of his time at the research facility his new foundation had leased, the trial moved forward, slowly but successfully. Without his father's interference, without the pressure to prioritize profits over patients, the work took on new meaning. Every breakthrough felt personal. Every patient who responded to treatment was a victory not just for science, but for the principle that some things mattered more than money. The first year was hard, harder than either of them had anticipated. There were nights when they ate ramen because that's all they could afford after paying their team-esque salaries. Mornings when Elena woke up panicking about whether they'd made the right choice. Moments when Julian stared at rejection letters from journals that had once competed to publish his work, now blacklisting him because his father had made calls. They were learning what it meant to build something from nothing, to be truly independent. And sometimes independence felt a lot like isolation. But there were other moments too, better ones, like the evening Elena came home to find Julian had cooked dinner, or rather had attempted to cook dinner and had mostly succeeded in covering the kitchen in flour. They'd laughed until they cried, then ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor because they still didn't have a proper dining table. Like the morning Julian's trial results came back showing a 73% improvement rate, and they'd danced around the tiny kitchen, spinning and laughing and crying with joy because it was working. The research was actually saving lives. Like the quiet Sunday afternoons they spent reading in companionable silence, her head on his shoulder, his hand playing with her hair, no agenda except existing in the same space. They were learning each other in ways the penthouse had never allowed. Elena discovered that Julian sang off-key in the shower and had a weakness for terrible action movies, that he still wrote poetry but now he shared it with her, reading new verses aloud while she made tea, that he had nightmares about his sister sometimes, and the only thing that helped was being held until the trembling stopped. Julian learned that Elena talked to herself when she was working through problems, carrying on full conversations with invisible opponents, that she was ruthlessly competitive at board games but gracious in defeat, that she cried during commercials about dogs but stayed stoic through actual crises. They were becoming experts in each other's humanity. 6 months after they'd left their families behind, Elena's phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Her father's voice came through the line, older sounding than she remembered. He told her that he'd been diagnosed with cancer, that the doctors were optimistic but he was facing a long treatment, that he'd been thinking about his life, about his choices, about what he'd sacrificed in the pursuit of power. He didn't apologize. Thomas Hartwell didn't know how to apologize, but he said he hoped she was well, that her work with the foundation had gotten press attention. Good press, the kind that made him realize she'd been right about some things, that maybe he'd been wrong about others. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even close to what she'd needed to hear. But it was acknowledgement, and somehow, that was enough. She told him she hoped his treatment went well, that she'd made her choice and didn't regret it, that she wished him peace. When she hung up, Julian held her while she cried for the father she'd never really had and the relationship that would never be repaired. But she also felt lighter, as if some weight she'd been carrying had finally been set down. Julian never heard from his father. Victor Cross was too proud, too rigid, too convinced of his own righteousness to ever admit doubt. But through mutual acquaintances, they learned that the pharmaceutical company had quietly started funding the kind of research they'd previously suppressed, that Victor had established a grant in his daughter's name for young researchers working on rare diseases. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't enough to undo years of damage, but it suggested that somewhere beneath the armor, something had shifted. That maybe their rebellion had planted seeds that were slowly, grudgingly, beginning to grow. On their second anniversary, not of their wedding but of their choice to fight for their freedom, Elena and Julian stood on the roof of their brownstone watching the sunset paint Brooklyn in shades of amber and rose. The city stretched out around them, full of millions of people living millions of lives, each one containing their own struggles and triumphs and impossible choices. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd chosen differently?" Elena asked, leaning against the railing. "If we'd just accepted the arrangement as it was, stayed in our separate corners and lived out our lives as strangers?" Julian was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we would have been comfortable, safe, miserable." He turned to look at her, the dying light catching in his eyes. "I think we would have spent our whole lives wondering what if. And that seems like the saddest thing in the world. To have found each other and then chosen to let fear keep us apart. Was it worth it?" she asked, though she knew the answer. She just needed to hear him say it. "Everything we lost. Everything we gave up." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "I used to think love was supposed to be easy, that if it was right, it wouldn't require sacrifice. But that's not love. That's just convenience. Real love, the kind that actually matters, it demands everything. It asks you to be braver than you knew you could be, to fight harder than seems reasonable, to choose the other person over and over, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you." Elena turned in his arms so she could see his face. "You didn't answer the question." "Yes," he said simply. "Every day, in every way, it was worth it. Because I'd rather have 1 year of really living with you than a lifetime of comfortable emptiness without you. I'd rather struggle and sacrifice and build something real than inherit something hollow. And I think, maybe, that's what freedom actually is. Not the absence of constraints, but the ability to choose your constraints, to decide what you're willing to carry and what you're brave enough to set down." They stayed on that roof until the stars came out, rare and faint against the city's light pollution but visible if you knew where to look. Below them, Brooklyn hummed with life. Somewhere in the foundation office, a program was changing a child's trajectory. Somewhere in the research facility, Julian's trial was giving hope to families who'd lost it. They had built something small but significant, something that mattered, not because it made them wealthy or powerful or prestigious, but because it was true. Was it possible to fall in love with someone you were never meant to feel anything for? That question seemed almost quaint now, a relic from a different life. The better question, the one that had emerged from the ashes of their arranged marriage, was something different entirely. Could you choose love even when everything else in your life was chosen for you? Could you look at the cage you were born into and decide to break free, knowing it would cost you everything except what mattered most? Elena and Julian had discovered that the answer was yes, but it wasn't a simple yes. It was complicated and difficult and required more courage than either of them had known they possessed. It required looking at everything they'd been given and saying, "This isn't enough if it means sacrificing who we are." It required burning bridges and starting over and accepting that some relationships would never be repaired. It required faith in something neither of them had been raised to value. Faith in love as something worth fighting for. Faith in each other as partners rather than opponents. Faith that building something real was more valuable than inheriting something false. In the end, their cold arrangement had taught them something their fathers never intended. That desire, genuine desire for connection and truth and authentic love, will always speak louder than promises made by people who don't understand what those words mean. That you can't force two people to remain strangers once they've truly seen each other. That the human heart, for all its vulnerability, is also impossibly resilient. It can survive being used as a weapon. It can emerge from betrayal. It can find light in the darkest manipulation. And when it finds another heart willing to be equally brave, equally honest, equally determined to choose love over safety, something extraordinary happens. Not a fairy tale, not a simple happily ever after, but something more real and more valuable. A partnership built on mutual choice. A love that survived being tested. A life that was smaller in scope but infinitely larger in meaning. As night settled over Brooklyn and the temperature dropped, Julian took off his jacket and wrapped it around Elena's shoulders. She smiled, remembering Vienna, remembering how everything had changed on a balcony not so different from this rooftop, how they'd stood on the edge of something terrifying and chosen to jump anyway. They went downstairs to their creaky, imperfect, beautiful brownstone, to the life they'd built with their own hands. To the future they were writing together one choice at a time, and if someone had asked them whether they regretted anything, whether they wished they'd chosen the easier path, they would have answered without hesitation. Some cages are gilded, some prisons are comfortable, but freedom, real freedom, is worth every sacrifice you make to claim it, especially when you're not claiming it alone. Retry.